Welcome to the What to Read Next podcast. In this podcast, your host, Lori and me, will interview published authors to chat about their work, journey to getting published, and their book recommendations. If you share a passion for books and always looking for your next read, then join us. Hi, Sonali. Hi, Virginia. Welcome to What to Read Next podcast.
Laura, thank you so much for having us. This is great.
Hi, Laura. Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
I'm so happy to talk to both of you. So let's go with Virginia first. Tell us a little bit about yourself and then Sonali.
Okay, well, I guess I was like Jo March in Little Women growing up because I wanted to be a writer, and I wrote plays for my neighbors to perform on their porch, and I wrote a newspaper with my sister, all that good stuff, and I am married for over 40 years. I have over 30 books. I have 3 kids. So I guess at this stage in my life, I'm feeling a little bit more like Marmee from Little Women.
I love this. So how about you, Sonali? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So much like Virginia, I too was like Jo March when I was little, because I exactly the same. My first writing experience, well, not first, but yeah, lots of plays, neighborhood plays. We performed at, we used to have this huge Diwali, which is the biggest Indian holiday, and I grew up in Bombay, and we used to have this, they used to construct this huge big stage in the middle of our neighborhood, and the kids all performed, and several years I wrote and performed plays with friends, so a lot of that. So I've always been a writer, much like Jo and Virginia, but I now write basically women's journeys from around the world. My newest series of books is my 4 favorite Jane Austen novels. They're not retellings. I feel like calling them retellings is a little, is stretching it a little bit, but they're homages to my 4 favorite Jane Austen novels. And they're Pride, Prejudice and Other Flavors, Recipe for Persuasion, Incense and Sensibility, and then the Emma one that's untitled will come out next year.
Oh my gosh. I'm so excited. So let's talk about reimagining, retelling, just taking some of those classic texts and just creating your own stories. Virginia, you did Little Women and you have a series, and then Sonali, you just mentioned you have Jane Austen retelling. So did you grow up reading those classic texts, or did you discover them later in life and you're like, oh my gosh, she's telling me a story that I can imagine, applying it to today's society?
I always did. My dad actually was an English professor. Mm-hmm. So earliest memories are bookshelves. And he never censored anything we read. So, any Greek plays and 19th century, The Rape of the Lock and Alexander Pope poems and Shakespeare plays. And I did get a copy of Little Women when I was 10 years old, which was a present to me and my sister from my grandmother. And it was abridged, which I didn't find out till I was a little older, and I read it for myself. I may have been in high school or college by then. Mm-hmm. And so much different, so much deeper, so much richer than I thought. And I kept rereading the story. The interesting thing was my perspective of the characters and the story changed as I grew up. So girls grew up with me, and stuff that never occurred to me or when I was younger, like Amy's ambition or Meg's domestic, trouble of being the mother of twins and renegotiating her marriage. That never, I went right over my head at 10. It probably went right over my head at 20. So I wanted to bring that perception to the story when I tackled the March sisters.
Mm. And how about you, Sonali? What was your experience with Jane Austen? When did you start reading her work?
So ironically, My first experience of Jane Austen was a retelling. So I was in middle school, seventh grade, I think, when there was this television show in India that was Pride and Prejudice set in an Indian setting. And when I say television show, I'm talking about Indian TV in the 80s, which was not 7,000 channels and 500 streaming services, but we had a few hours of programming every day. So it was, the making of a new show was a huge event. I mean, even until 2 decades ago, there was a spotlight on new creations like that, right? It wasn't 30 new things coming out in one day. So this was a big deal. All the adults were talking about it. It was called Trishna, which means thirst. And it was essentially, scene by scene, Pride and Prejudice, but in an Indian family. And you'll be amazed. I mean, Pride and Prejudice is about a mom trying to find, or one aspect of Pride and Prejudice is that it's about a mother trying to get her daughters married off, which growing up was a huge part of Indian society. Mm-hmm. So it was perfect. Jane Austen might as well have lived in 1980s in Mumbai. So so that was my introduction, and I remember watching it, and it was like being hit by a bat, because there was, for the first time in my life, there was a protagonist who had opinions, who didn't pander to who didn't do what was expected of her, things she didn't want to, who didn't pander not just to men but to to society, to what the aunties wanted, what everybody else wanted from her, and she was loved for it. And there was something deep inside me, this belief that was not really being reinforced by the world around me, that was just like, that found its home. And I was like, what is this wonderful thing? This is me on the screen, or this is the me I want to be. And I was, in seventh grade, and I ran out and I got, that's when I checked out the book from my library. And I've read it, innumerable times since then. And I've read 4 of her novels innumerable times over the years. And so that was kind of my introduction to it. And I do genuinely believe that it actually changed the course of my life in terms of who I became, because in so many ways, over and over again, it reinforced what I believed, about the world and all of that. And so it's very almost, intrinsic to who I am. Those stories are just so I think of this more as an homage to the lessons I learned from Jane Austen, even more than the plots and the characters, because they're so internalized, right, Viginia? I mean,
I think that's so significant, because when you were talking about that, I remember reading about the March sisters. And at the time that I was growing up, and I read widely, but there were a lot of books written for children, young people, young adults, where the heroes were boys. You could have a girl who was a sidekick. You could have a girl who was not even necessarily a love interest. You could have a tag along annoying. And yet here was this book written in 1868, where the main characters, the main actors, were women, and they're four very different women. And then if you add in the, Abigail March, and you add in Aunt Josephine, Aunt Fee, they were all very clear, distinct women's voices, and they were doing interesting things, so I too, it says that on the cover that my books are contemporary retellings of Little Women, but they're not. They are an homage to that idea and follow of girls doing interesting things, women doing interesting things,
without ending up dead, right, and miserable, which is what we saw so much of. I mean, Beth, poor thing, which you fixed for us.
If you have that, then you must throw yourself in front of a train. If you have I mean, I was an English major. There's hardly any book where the woman had sex who didn't die horribly that I didn't read.
Yes, or lose their minds and haunt the men who loved them, and then ran around for the rest of their lives yelling their names into the darkness. I mean, it was, and I wanted to talk about the abridged thing you said, because when I became an adult reader, I was so angry with this abridging business because these beautiful novels that just seem god awful when you read them. Jane Eyre, I remember. So if not for my grandmother, Jane Eyre was my grandmother's favorite novel.
Okay.
And I mean, imagine, if you will, this sari wearing, soft grandma, and I would cuddle up with her every afternoon, all my summers as a child, and she would tell me about that Mr. Rochester, with stars in her eyes, and she totally had a crush on Mr. Rochester. And I was like, so I knew the book, but then when I read it in 8th grade, the abridged version, I was like, this thing, like, I don't understand. Like, this is awful. And then when I read the actual Jane Eyre, which is so much more complex, and Rochester is not this deep, dark character, but somebody who actually has this inner lightness in scenes, I was like, what did they do to this beautiful book?
Well, the other issue then too is the movie, right? I mean, if you watch movies of Jane Eyre, I have yet to have, I mean, it sets up, a movie never has as much time as a novel.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And so they have to shorthand things. And I think that Jane's insistence on being an equal, which is vital to that book not being a Me Too tragedy.
Yeah.
The fact that she actually has the upper hand in that relationship, especially for the time it was written.
Yes.
Gets lost under almost any recreation of the story.
Absolutely. And absolutely. And because I think when they pick out parts that are supposed to be important, there's no way to whittle it down. And
Right.
I think that, on the outside, without reading the detail, Rochester is this incredibly dark hero. But in the full book, he really is not.
Well, I mean, I will tell you, and if we're going to tackle another 19th century book in the near future, which it's not happening in the near future, I would really like to wade into that one. But we'll as it is, I agree, it's one of those books that it's tough to shorten, it's tough to get it right, and it's tough because so many people assume they know it because maybe they haven't read the original.
Oh yeah, which makes me so sad.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you must experience the same thing as a reteller of Austen. Yes, no?
See, I never thought of it as that. That's the thing, that because I was always so clear that these are my stories and that this is not Pride and Prejudice, and that I think annoys some people who pick it up expecting it to be an Indian translation of or an Indian American translation of Pride and Prejudice or Persuasion. It's not. These are homages to the themes. So
I've definitely gotten my knuckles wrapped on that one as well, and it's to be fair, because of marketing the book, especially as the Greta Gerwig movie was coming out that same month, you want to call it a contemporary retelling of Little Women, but what it is it's a coming of age. What I've written is 2 coming of age novels, and I think we don't come of age now. I mean, most women in the United States, at least, are not going to work at 15. They're not getting married at 18. They're not responsible for the financial support of their families and living at home until they marry. And so I think of the modern coming of age as being in your 20s. And so I aged the characters up. And what I really tried to do was talk about these different models and how they might move through the modern world. And so they're reimaginings with the expectations set up. It definitely, there are people who want to see, you know, Christian Bale in the 1994 version, you know, making eyes at Winona Ryder. And I'm never going to write that. I'm never going to be able to do that. All I'm going to be able to do is tell my story, drawing on my own life and my own emotions.
I do feel, though, that yours are very faithful to the characters.
Yes, I try.
Very much so. I feel like your Joe is Joe and your Meg is Meg, you know, and your certainly Beth was probably the only one. And yet I think it was brilliant what you did with Beth. But with all of the others, they're very much that. And I feel like yours are more faithful retellings, even in spirit, for me.
I think that because of the warmth and the charm and the fact that there haven't been that many retellings of Little Women. And yet Louisa May Alcott is an American, she is our Jane Austen, right? I mean, she tells the ultimate American sisters book. And so I didn't want to lose that warmth and charm, and I didn't want to stray too far from characters that I knew and loved so well. So yes, to that extent, I think that I tried to capture the March sisters as they would move through, grown up and moving through a contemporary world.
And I think you do it wonderfully. Absolutely. You know, it's just it's to me it was a complete revisit, not just I think into Little Women, but all the things I felt as a young girl when I read it.
Oh, so what a beautiful compliment. And one of the things that I don't think, well, I mean, I don't read all your reviews, I just read all your books. But one of the things I think you do really that deserves to be sort of part of any conversation about your books is the social commentary. Because, you know, you can shorthand Pride and Prejudice and say it's about a woman desperate to get her 5 daughters married. And it is, and that's great fun.
It's so not though, but you know, I said it. So
well, and I think what I was going to say was actually one of the things I think you do exceptionally well in all of your books, which I have read, including Incense and Sensibility, which I adored, is that you do that let me take a clear Jane Austen eye to some of the foibles of the society, to some of the types that could use, not skewering, we don't want to skewer, but let's at least poke some of these preconceptions and expectations. And I think that's something that, in terms of theme, you do very well.
Thank you. And that's all I really wanted to do with these. I mean, I definitely, with how, and you said it, right? I mean, given, is it not the most retold book in history, Pride and Prejudice especially? I mean, everybody has done, if not clearly retold it, done homages to it in their book, right, in various scenes. I mean, it's just iconic. So the question of setting out to simply translate that into another culture was just something and people have done it beautifully, and people have done it really well in terms of, you know, translating cynicism and humor across cultures and all of that, which they did. That was just not my intention when I was telling the story. It was very much thematic. It was very much, you know, what was she trying to say about her world and what that taught me, you know, and how that translates into a story that is all mine, was basically what it was for me.
And I think for me, tackling the March sisters, it was emotional. Now, I did not know when I started writing that we were about to be plunged into a pandemic.
Oh gosh.
And I can say that there were specific challenges to writing about family and connection at a time that I could not go visit my mother or hug my children.
Mhm.
And yet, if anything, I feel that this was a time when we need stories like that. When stories about families pulling together in tough times, or being separated by distance, but still having a strong connection, or being really different personalities and still being able to love one another and support one another and have each other's backs. Those were all, as I say, I mean, we could call them themes, or we could just say that they're things that I deeply believe in and was eager to explore. And so it made writing this book, I mean, I do go some pretty dark places, especially in Beth and Amy. You can't not. But I think the important part was showing how we can draw on the strength of family, and we can find the strength within ourselves, and we can go with love. So that was a challenge for me. How was it like for you, Sonali, going through the pandemic?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about Beth, and because
Oh.
it's because that is the greatest departure again from the original in terms of plot. And I thought it was absolutely brilliant, and I want to know, and I'll bet the hardest part of writing this was Beth, because I mean, all of us have some level of that, but it's completely I think not okay for those of us. It's painful enough in small quantities, but the actual full blown challenge of that disorder or that mental illness is so humongous that to go there in a book like this. I want to hear more about that.
Well, she didn't start out that way. Okay. I think I had written Meg and Joe. We sent it to my editor, and I had written a synopsis for Beth and Amy in which Beth had, I am not making this up, she had gone to the rescue of some animals in flooded waters in Iowa, because the spring floods in Iowa were a big thing that year. And she contracted a rare animal-borne virus.
Remember this? Oh my gosh, I remember discussing this with you. And it wasn't so ridiculous when we discussed it, remember?
I don't, I need her to be doing something. The good dead girl was a staple of Victorian literature. I mean, talking about Jane Eyre, remember her little friend in the orphanage, Helen?
Helen, oh my gosh, poor Helen. She was the nightmares of my childhood.
Okay, so saintly Helen and Beth, March, and hell, the little match girl, right? They're all part of that the good girl who dies. That's what we're going to call it. That doesn't have, there's the good, we said there's the woman who has sex and throws herself under the train. Then there's the good girl who never has sex, who is too pure for this world, so she dies. And there was even I did a lot of research on Louisa May Alcott. There was a poem published in like around 1850, but Louisa May Alcott would certainly have been familiar with it, called The Angel in the House. Based on the Coventry Patmore was the poet, and it would have been a meme, right? Everybody knew about the angel in the house. And if you read Louisa May Alcott, there she is. Beth is the angel, too pure for this world. Even her canary dies, right? I mean, that's as if we needed to prefigure it anymore. Everybody else is dreaming about their futures. She's going, I can't wait to go to my heavenly kingdom. Yeah, she's doomed, right? But what it really is the impossibility of a young woman living up to these expectations of perfection. So she doesn't want to grow up. She has these strong expectations of perfection. She struggles with feelings of autonomy and control in her own life. She effectively erases herself from a lot of the scenes she's in. In Louisa May Alcott's time, a lot of young women died in childhood or in childbirth. If you're modernizing that, what are the dangers that face our young women now? What are the dangers that face us now? What is it that we do to ourselves to erase ourselves, to occupy less space in our own lives? So my husband came home from the shop, and I looked at him and I said, I think I know what's wrong with Beth, because I know that girl. I was that girl. And he said, well, honey, you can do it, but you're going to have to go there if you do. So I did, and I hope that I did it in a way that other women who may be struggling with issues of perfectionism and body image, who may be trying to control some of the few things that they think they can control in a way that's not ultimately to their own good. I hope that they can see in Beth a way forward, a way to say yes instead of no.
Yeah, and I love that she learns that, and and it's ongoing, right? There is no one solution and done. Every one of us, irrespective of size or or level to which we struggle, I think that it's an ongoing struggle. It's an ongoing struggle that our world feeds continuously, right? Every visual continuously just is bombarding us with something that feeds that need to erase, that need to lessen, to become smaller, to be perfect, all of that. And I will say that in my lifetime, from the time I was a little girl to now, I hope that we've made, we've this. Sometimes I think it's really different for our girls, but sometimes I think it's not. It's worse in different ways. So yeah,
I think that, and one of the ways that it's much harder, of course, is technology. Oh. I mean, because now there's always been judgment, but now perfect strangers feel free to judge and to comment, and you don't need to be a celebrity. You just need an Instagram account or a Facebook account.
Yeah, and we're all stars now, right? We're all stars. I remember thinking, child stars, and I was always fascinated when I was growing up by why there were these horrific after stories of every child star ever, right? I was convinced that there is something inherently not right to living in the spotlight in your formative years, right? And this has proven it, that it's a hard thing for us to process in our 40s and 50s and 60s with the minimal spotlight we have. So naturally but today everyone is a child star, right? Because everyone has has a spotlight if they want it, and everyone wants it. So
one of the things you created a whole character, honestly, around that, the difficulties of being a child star. And I adore her. I love the way, and you did it in more than one way, because you have so many strong women in your Raj books. And, you have a woman who takes the spotlight as a social activist. You have a woman who takes the spotlight as a literal child star. and you show all that. I think you do a really great job of balancing both their inner strengths and the tension between that self that they have to project out to the world, or that's imposed upon them by the world. So talk to me about, was that as you go through her children, was that a conscious decision when you were creating the backstory for your matriarch in the Raj book?
So Meena is she's, I mean, I love her, and she was, but I hadn't really made the exact connection until this minute when I said I was always fascinated by that. I was always fascinated by the violation and the violence of putting a child in a situation that a child is not ready to face, right?
Mhm.
And yet with the art and with cinema and all of that, there are roles that require children, and these are already children with a high level of talent or ability, something. So it already, the world is not not easy for them just by having that. And then so Mina's is not even that. It's taking that and then really, how like thematically you filter down to the darkest part of something. And so Mina's character and Mina's backstory really is all of that, but times just being used by your own parent for for making a living in the worst possible way, right? So she has because that's the one of the themes, is that as a parent we're continuously trying to make the world easier for our children, and children who grow up with that 100%, there is this person who will throw himself and herself in front of a bullet for me. The confidence, the privilege of that confidence is larger than wealth, is larger than all of the other privileges we can give our children, right? That belief that they are loved. And then what about a person like her, where your first line of defense is your worst enemy, right? Is the person who is most using you. And so that contrast of, because I think a lot of this, the way that the Rajas were created was the fact that, I was, there is this whole history of royalty and princely states, with the backdrop of colonization and how that has worked through history. So I was always fascinated by that, because Indian royalty became figureheads when colonization happened, and it was done in a very strange way, because they got to keep their properties, they got to keep their titles, but they had no governance except no governance power except collecting taxes for the British. And so it was this really weird kind of strange subculture that was created. And so I was always fascinated by that. But in terms of Austen, I think the thing I was trying to do is explore privilege, all the various kinds of. So where the Rajas came from was the Darcy character, where Darcy is the epitome, right, of privilege of his times. He has every single thing that gives you a leg up, right? And what does it turn him into? Initially, and then with work, what does that turn him into? And so a lot of with that self-awareness that gets lost when you have that level of, that's what I was trying to explore. And so
I think great job too with Yash, in terms of whose name I always slightly mispronounce.
Yes.
Yash, right?
Yash, like rush. Yeah.
Yash. So the hero of Incense and Sensibility, for people who have not yet read the book, I think you do a wonderful job there of talking about the burden of his privilege, or of his awareness of his privilege.
Yes, and that's also a little bit of a little tongue-in-cheek thing, because I'm always rolling my eyes at people who are burdened by their privilege, and there is some of that, I hope, in the storytelling, but yeah. So although technically Yash is Edward Ferrars and Trisha was was Darcy. But notwithstanding, yes. So I think a lot of the Rajas came from exploring privilege, and one of the ways that you have to do when you explore something is you have to put it in contrast with the lack thereof, right? And so you're kind of contrasting these characters and their backgrounds and seeing how they've interacted, and how it makes some people better people, and how it brings out the worst in others. And I think that's kind of where Mina's background, and how she's trying so hard for that not to be repeated for her children, to be the exact opposite of her own parentage, and then where Shri, her husband, fits into that, and their marriage. And I really had such a great time doing those two.
Well, I love the fact that I think one thing that we both enjoy doing is like showing parents who are good, loving parents, and not
absolutely
perfect.
Because I mean, is it, as parents ourselves, where is the perfection, right? Every day is an error. Oh my gosh, what did I do wrong today?
Yeah. I mean, it's like please let me. And that was another area where I took a little bit of heat, because everybody who remembers saintly Mr. March and may not know Bronson Alcott, Louisa Alcott's own dad, who was, when she was 10 years old, he moved the entire family off to this commune style farm called Fruitlands, where they had to refrain from all stimulants, which included hot water,
oh my
and
God,
caffeine and alcohol and sex. And after about 7 months of this, his wife was like, Louisa May Alcott's mother was like, I've had enough. And she packed up the girls and she left. But it was and so my Mr. March was based, and their relationship was really drawing more on that, and relationships in my own life, perhaps, than on the standard saintly Mr. March of the book. But I think you have to give parents their humanity.
Absolutely. And I think one of my favorite things about both those books, both of your books, Megan Jo and Beth and Amy, is that ongoing arc of their parents' life across the two books, and the fact that they continue to grow, right? I mean, one of my favorite things in Beth and Amy is how the redemption happens. It's not easy, right? It's not like, oh, suddenly but the remorse is there. And I think it's this, I sometimes feel like we're trying to make, as women authors, we're trying to make these excuses / somehow make this patriarchy okay, right? And so we're like, why? And what would it look like if these men who were canonized and idolized just accepted how much easier it was for them, and and I think that journey, you did that with him. He, without vilifying him, right? And yet you want to slap him sometimes, but you've not vilified him in a bad way, because that's the reality of all the men of a certain generation in our lives to some extent, right?
I think it's also a real issue for both ministers and for veterans, how they connect with their families, and how much of the burden falls on the support, the spouse. But you're really good. It's interesting that you said redemption, because of course that's another theme in your books. And it is. I mean, it because sometimes it frames itself more as self-awareness. But let's face it, Yash has a lot to make up for.
He does, but I think with Yash, to me, the thing is intention and nobility, right? Isn't that one of the, and I don't mean nobility in terms of class, I mean nobility in terms of us trying to be the best human beings we can be. And I think one of the reasons, to me, Yash is so what is the word I'm looking for, significant to me personally, is that his intention, is always, which doesn't, but then in the end it means squat, right? It means squat. It means nothing if you're going to make bad decisions because of it. And and if you're going to, and self-flagellation is never the answer, right? And so to me, there's a lot of that with Yash. And I have to say, I think one of the things that was so lovely in doing in writing India was, she's my first heroine in 8 books who is sorted, who is a woman who is not broken, in some way. She is, she's, and I think she's exactly like that is the thing with Yash. And Eleanor is like that, right? Eleanor is sorted for everybody in her life.
I love her solidity as a character. I mean, it's like she moves from the appropriate. I don't do yoga, but she has like the center of gravity. She moves from a not a heart place, not a head place. She moves from her pelvis in a way. I mean, just her, and I don't even mean that sexually. I just mean she's just seems really grounded in.
Yes. Yeah.
That's delightful to watch. I mean, I want to be her friend, but I'm your friend, so that's
so which is bringing us full circle to your question about the pandemic.
Yeah.
And so these are the books we wrote in the pandemic, and and I sometimes wonder, the fact that I wrote a woman who is unbroken and a woman who is so solid, and kind of solid enough to fix everything around her in the pandemic. And I think there's something there.
You took on all that responsibility. I will this.
Maybe there's something there. I'll figure it out someday. But I'm like, okay, the only truly badass and whole and fully sorted heroine I've written in the pandemic. So there's something there.
Well, I think it's the same thing when I wrote Abby March.
She's a fixer. She's there for everybody, and you cannot topple her for anything. So
yeah, it's like we Mama's got this. I think was the
Mama's got the worst backache in history, and she's still got this. Virginia.
The only reason I made her sick in the first book is like Marmee is such an essential part of that story that the girls cannot come to full adulthood as if Mama's too active. And the reason it works in Beth and Amy that she's in her power is that the girls have actually, with the exception of Beth and to a certain extent Amy, and that scene when Amy gets in bed with her mother just made me cry when I wrote it in a good way. But her girls have moved beyond her. And then what's next? If you're not the fixer, if your children have problems, you can't soothe with a cookie and a kiss on the forehead. What do you do?
Yes, you tell me. I'm getting there. Actually, not fast enough, but.
Well, I think some of the pleasure then is watching them both soar without you and make mistakes without you too.
Yeah, and our listeners should know that Virginia is a very, very dear friend, and a mom advisor too. Other than being a wonderful critique partner and writing, partner, she's like, "Oh my gosh, my kids did this. What do I do?" And Virginia's like, "Breathe. This is what happened to me." And my well-grown children are, it will turn out.
And that's the thing is you love them and you want to take responsibility for their accomplishments, but you can't.
They're not yours, yeah.
And you take on responsibility for their occasional small, we won't even call them failures, setbacks, we'll call them. And you can't. That's not yours either. That's not on you either.
Yeah, anyone who's not read the Khalil Gibran poem on parenting absolutely must do it. It is like a single, I think 14 line, the best parenting book you'll ever read in one short poem.
There you go.
I love this. So tell us where we can find you online.
Okay, I'm easy. It's ViginiaKantra.com. I'm on Facebook more than I should be, and I'm wading into Instagram with more enthusiasm than a skill. And I'm hardly ever on Twitter, but ViginiaKantra.com will always find me.
Love this.
And the same for me, it's sonalidev.com. And I'm on Instagram a lot. That is probably the best side of me in terms of social media angle. I'm on Facebook. I have my own reader group. If you are a reader and that's, you want to discuss the books and a little bit more personal, it's called Dev Nation. Sonali Dev Nation. So and I have a newsletter that goes out once a month, and it's the 3 R's, which is a recipe, a recommendation, and a really bad joke from my family group chat, because I share the bounty of bad jokes that my family sends me. So sign up for that. You get a free recipe book. If you do, I'm barely ever on Twitter, but I'm there. And I'm on Facebook, but mostly Instagram, and sonalidev.com is your one-stop shop for all of that.
So I want to thank you both for an amazing conversation. I felt like I think our listeners are eavesdropping on a conversation among friends, and it just feels so good. Like, I really love chatting with both of you. Well, just eavesdropping in your conversation.
Thank you. We're so sorry we went off.
Yeah, we're good.
This is thank you so much, Laura, because quite honestly, this is part of the Sonali and I palette conferences. Well, we haven't been anywhere for, a year and a half. So this has been wonderful to visit with you and to catch up with Sonali and to say hi to your listeners and our readers. So thank you.
Thank you. Exactly what Virginia said. Thanks.
If you enjoyed this podcast, feel free to share with friends, subscribe, rate, and review the show. This is the easiest way to support the podcast. For book recommendations, author interview archives, and other fun book resources and tips, please visit watchrenexblog.com. The Watch Read Next podcast is part of the Frolic Network. To discover new shows to listen and love, please visit frolic.media/podcast. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day.